This is the story about the Blue Gremlin, the biggest red herring in the entire case. I've received information regarding the automobile participation in these 4 murders as late as November last year, when the Oakland County prosecutor finally gave me some documents. The King family has known since the beginning it was highly unlikely that Tim left the Hunter Pharmacy in a parking lot in a Blue Gremlin. And the papers I received last November state that the source of the Blue Gremlin was from one man who went to the task force after Tim was abducted and said he saw Tim talking to somebody adjacent to a Blue Gremlin. I do not recall any other publicly described car. As late as June 1, 1978, when the task force was still in existence, they prepared a flyer. The only artistic item on the flyer was a Blue Gremlin. The rest was all words. This is more than a year after Tim was abducted. And the reason we don't believe Tim left the Hunter Maple parking lot in a Blue Gremlin is because of his brother Chris. Chris had turned 16 the day before Tim was abducted, just got his driver's license, and had probably the first time in his life, like all the rest of us, started paying attention to cars. He was babysitting that night, got home after the stores closed, and knew that Tim was missing. He knew that that was not normal. He took his baseball bat and went out looking for him. And you don't take your baseball bat unless you anticipate trouble. 16 years old. He got to the parking lot. The stores were closed, and there were at most 3 or 4 cars in the parking lot, one of which was a Blue Gremlin. And he said he had read someplace about some Levi upholstery in Blue Gremlins, and he even went over and looked in to see if it had that type of upholstery. And he reported this to the police. 16-year-old kid, all of these other adults and law enforcement people running around. And I haven't seen anything in the reports about Chris telling them that, but that's understandable because at that time we didn't know about Chris Busch, and that report would not be in the Chris Busch files. It would have been someplace else. In June of 2012, Mr. Walton, as I've told you, met with Lisa Milton, Chris, and me at Lisa's office. And I asked him I told him Chris's story. And he said that that's not correct. It's not in the report. Well, I went and talked to Chris about it. And he said, Dad, the only report I ever gave was the day after Tim was abducted, March the 17th. The Blue Gremlin was not in the paper until several days later. So I couldn't have reported to anybody about that in that regard. When I passed that information along to Walton, I got no apology and no response. But it's evidence to me that as late as June of last year, the Oakland County prosecutor thought the car involved was still a Blue Gremlin. An acquaintance of mine asked me if I'd like to talk to Richard Thompson. Now, you'll recall Mr. Thompson was the chief assistant prosecutor in Oakland County in '77 and ultimately became prosecutor. And I went to a social function in his neighborhood where Mr. Thompson was soliciting money to challenge Obamacare. I introduced myself, and the first thing Mr. Thompson said to me was the Blue Gremlin. Well, he wasn't there to talk to me, but I did call him later, and he said, I don't normally respond to these, but if you'll send me some information, I'll get back to you. I took the excerpts from the file related to Mr. Thompson. The one of primary concern to me was the Michigan State Police reports show that Mr. Thompson was present when Christopher Busch was polygraphed on January 28, 1977. The police reports indicate 2 modes of transportation. At one point, somebody said he flew up by a helicopter from Pontiac. The other one said he drove up in a heavy snowstorm. But we know he was present when Christopher Busch was polygraphed. What's his reaction? 5 years later, the Blue Gremlin. all the emphasis has been on the Blue Gremlin, more so than people. When I got the files from Prosecutor Cooper in November 2012, there's a September 9, 1978 typewritten memo signed by Lieutenant Robertson, who was in charge of the Oakland County Task Force. And it covers cars associated with all 4 kids. On Mark Stebbins, there's a paragraph saying that there was a small Pontiac or Buick near the site where he was located. In regard to Jill Robertson, somebody saw a car adjacent to I-75 where her body was found and made note of it because it was parked alongside the road, and then moved on when he approached him and stopped again. And he described it as a 1967 Pontiac. And probably the most important one to me was the report on the car where Christine Mihalik was found. When the investigators got to the scene, there was an imprint in a snowbank of a bumper. And for reasons I don't know, Jack Kalbfleisch from Birmingham was present at a body found in Franklin Village, but thank goodness he was. I talked to Jack, and he's told me that he was very upset that nobody took measurements of that bumper imprint. But he did get somebody to take some photographs of it. He took these photographs to a photography specialist, and the photography specialist said he could, within 1/16 of an inch, give him the dimensions of what was in the snowbank. That included a bumper with a trailer hitch, which was a little askew, but they didn't know what kind of car it was. Jack then took these drawings to the automobile companies in Detroit, and General Motors told him that it came from a 1971 Pontiac Le Mans or a Buick Scarlock. And then there's a report about Tim and the Blue Gremlin. But it's a one-page typewritten page. I don't know. It has no title on it. It's signed by Lieutenant Robertson and was obviously signed before the task force was adjourned in December of 1978. Also among the papers I got from Prosecutor Cooper was a letter dated July 20th, 1996, from Lieutenant Kalbfleisch to the Birmingham Police Department. And he points out Jill being involved with the 1971 Pontiac. He points out that Mark was associated with a small Pontiac or Buick, and he goes on at length about what they found in the snowbank. Well, this was several years after Jack had retired. I do know that from talking to him that he's participated in the national grouping for missing children. And he said, send this on to the state police or the Oakland County Prosecutor. And that file, or that letter, was in the papers I got from the Oakland County Prosecutor. And then a very fortuitous thing happened early this year. Several times my wife Janice had told me that they had a friend who was hypnotized. Steve said that he had somebody who was hypnotized. Well, her son Steve hadn't been born when Timmy was abducted, and I didn't pay much attention to it. But about the third time that she mentioned it to me, I said, well, he wasn't born, and Steve was also her first husband's name. So her husband, Steve, had told her that. He's now deceased, so we couldn't get hold of him. But she did remember the gentleman's name was Doug, and she made 2 or 3 phone calls to their mutual friends. This Doug and her husband Steve worked as car designers at Chrysler, and they knew automobiles. I can't tell a Malibu from an Impala, but they would obviously recognize those. She made several phone calls and found out that the gentleman was named Doug Wilson and he was working for a Japanese company out in San Diego. I called the company and spoke with Doug. And he told essentially this story, that he mentioned to his wife that he'd seen Tim up at the parking lot that night. He was reluctant to tell anybody, but his wife and some other friends urged him to go to the police, and he did. And he agreed to be hypnotized. I don't know anything about hypnosis, but I do remember him telling me he thought he was under hypnosis for 20 minutes, and it was 4 hours. And he was also very impressed with how it restored his memory. I guess if we have good memories, we'd like to be hypnotized, and maybe not if we didn't. And he told them that when he got to the parking lot, he was driving an Alfa Romeo automobile, which I understand is an expensive foreign car. He said when he got there, he was near a Le Mans automobile in which an older gentleman was present. He kept looking at him. He said he even thought maybe the guy wanted to steal his car, so he parked some distance from the Le Mans. He did recall seeing Tim there, saw him come down the hill, hit the grocery store with his skateboard, and they did some testing at the site that he identified, and they did find paint scrapings consistent with Timmy's skateboard. And he said there was also a young man moving very rapidly, and that caught his attention, and he remembered that. And I don't ever recall anybody running to or from a grocery store, so maybe that's stuck in his memory. He also was so concerned about this Le Mans and thought it was unusual that he tried to remember the license plate. And but he couldn't recall the letters. He thought he could, and he said he even used a word thing. I know I remember my license plate by words and not letters. My Lucerne has BFF, and it's always Barry's French fries when I have to go into the hotel. He did remember the last 3 digits were 222. And that's what he told me at that time. But he did say to the police officers, how come there's all this emphasis on the Blue Gremlin? And Lieutenant Kalbfleisch and Special Agent Nickel of the FBI conducted the hypnosis, told him that they thought the Le Mans was a very good lead, but they were not taking the Blue Gremlin off the papers because they didn't want to alert the Le Mans drivers. You can understand when you go through all of this why Jack Kalbfleisch is still upset that nobody's followed up on these other automobile leads. And my family's concerned that if somebody didn't have a Blue Gremlin, they didn't turn them in. More than the names of the kids, everybody remembers this case as the Blue Gremlin. And I had another interesting adjunct to that. I got a call from Corey Williams. He said, Barry, how'd you find this guy, Doug Wilson? And I told him the story about how fortuitous it was that I'd married Janice, because if I hadn't married Janice, we wouldn't know anything about it. And the state police and the Oakland County prosecutor have never shared that Doug Wilson information with Wayne County. Why can't they talk to each other? I would like an explanation. But, as I told you at the beginning of this talk, the Blue Gremlin is a red herring, remains a red herring, and in my judgment had nothing to do with the abduction of any of these 4 children.